I'll start as soon as you guys are all set. All right, a very good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session on what effect will the election super year have on trade. Thank you very much to you all for joining what I think promises to be a very rich discussion. My name is Olivia O'Sullivan. I'm the director of our UK in the World research programme here at Chatham House. We're absolutely delighted to welcome our panel to this discussion. We have Dr. Seema Farazi, who is a partner at EY and leads on global immigration for government affairs there. Karim Fatehi, MBE, is the interim chief executive of the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry, LCCI. Keith Rockwell is a senior research fellow at the Hinrich Foundation. Did I pronounce it right, Keith? Yeah. Great. And a former director at the WTO. And finally, Dr. Emily Jones is associate professor in public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. And we're also very lucky that she's an associate fellow here at Chatham House. So this discussion is going to run in the following way. We'll shortly hear from each of our panel in turn. I've asked them to make about 3 to 5 minutes of comments on the general themes of this discussion. We'll then open up for a moderated discussion and Q&A. So I may put a couple of follow-up questions back to them, but from that point onwards, primarily it will be over to you. Please do feel free to make comments, but do keep your comments concise if possible. And if you are asking a question, please do formulate it as a question for our panel. I'll come to people in the room, so feel free to just raise your hands. Do introduce yourself, your name and where you're from when you ask a question. If you're joining us online, we're delighted to have you. I will be keeping an eye on the question box in the Zoom call, and I will put some of our online audience questions to the panel as well. A reminder to everyone that this event is on the record and will be live streamed, so we are not under the Chatham House rule this time. On to our discussion. In this panel, we wanted to look at the kind of big, crucial sets of elections this year and what could happen to the global trade landscape as a consequence of them. I'm sure everyone is kind of daily aware that we are looking at a crucial presidential election in the United States, which may shape that country's orientation to the trade order in quite radical ways. We're looking at intensifying competition between the US and China, and it will be interesting to see how that may or may not be intensified by the results of that election. We also have European Parliament elections this year and, of course, UK elections, all of which present potentially new opportunities, but also new risks and questions for the global trade order. I think it is a particularly interesting time to be reflecting on the intersection between democracy and trade. We've seen a more protectionist turn in recent years from the US and Europe, but also from many advanced economies and emerging markets. Some of that is about strategic competition. Some of that is about powering the green transition. Some of it might be about onshoring industries and securing votes in swing states, and very difficult, messy, fundamental democratic questions about what role should the state play in the economy. We recently saw an excellent research presentation here from Global Trade Alert, here at Chatham House from Global Trade Alert, which found the aggregate value of corporate subsidies linked to industrial policy announced just since the start of 2023 amount to $1.7 trillion. That's counting up industrial policy corporate subsidy measures from economies around the world, $1.7 trillion just since the start of 2023. And much of those were directed, or at least nominally directed, at climate change mitigation. So this is not going away. And I think there are very significant questions about how these kinds of policies, of course, affect global free trade and its institutions. We have an excellent panel to talk us through these questions, and I will stop talking now and hand over to them to tell us a bit more about that. The order in which I'm going to ask them to speak to us is Dr. Emily Jones is very kindly going to give us an overview of some of these issues and how we should think about the coming year and the different pressures on governments making these decisions. Keith is going to similarly talk through some of these themes, but with a bit more of a focus on the US and what we can expect. We also have an exciting democratic experiment from Chatham House when Keith talks, because we're going to try to run a poll. I'll talk you through that when it comes. Kareem is very kindly going to give us a bit more of a view from a kind of a business perspective. How is LCCI advising businesses about navigating this environment? And then finally, Seema is going to introduce what I think is a really critical electoral and trade issue, which is the role that immigration plays in all these questions. So without further ado, could I hand over to you, Emily, for your opening remarks?
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be with you all. So I'm going to do my best in my opening remarks to put some big trends and what I think, how to understand what's happening. And first off, I think we saw last week that looming elections in the United States and India certainly didn't help the processes at the WTO ministerial. And I think Ignacio's already alluded to this. But instead of drilling down into specific election dynamics, what I wanted to do is step back and sort of think about some of the big trends that are happening, the longer-term economic and electoral trends, I think, and what they mean for trade policy. And I'm going to focus on the advanced economies and those elections that you spoke of. And I'm going to speak to two major trends. There are other ones, but I think there's two I wanted to highlight and think through their implications. The first is China and the major shift in the global economy towards China, but more generally towards the dynamic part of the global economy being the emerging market economies and their rapid ascent and growth in terms of economic importance. And I think what that means is we're now in this very much a multipolar world order, and we've seen this, as we all know, result in new tensions, particularly the US-China dynamic. What's really interesting here is I think we've seen right across Western countries these moves to de-risk supply chains, as well as, so I think there's a de-risking and sort of reducing vulnerability. There's also, and I think it's quite important to distinguish between the two, a move to cut China off from specific critical frontier technologies. And it's quite striking, I think, that there's actually quite a lot of continuity on both of those, cross-party, so right across the political party spectrum. And on these particular areas, I don't think we're going to see that much shift as we get electoral swings. And I think we've seen this in particular in the United States, because for all the rhetorical differences, if you actually look at what the Biden administration has done, there's generally the big story is continuity vis-a-vis China. And we've got a different rhetorical packaging of that, but I think continuity and intensification of Trump's approach is probably the main headline to take away. I do, however, think that elections are far more pertinent to the second economic trend I want to talk about. And that is the, I think, very sobering reality that over the last few decades, in many advanced economies, and again, I'm going to focus on these advanced economies, we're in a period of long-term economic stagnation, low productivity, rising inequality, the hollowing out of middle-class jobs, an increase in precarity, and cost of living, particularly the supply-side shocks we've seen recently. And that's really felt in the bottom segment of society, right, the poorer households. At the same time, among younger people, a real deeper and growing concern about the environment, and Jennifer talked to a lot of that in the previous panel. And trust in institutions in a lot of our democracies is really low. Citizens don't trust that governments are getting it right when it comes to the economic model. There's a real feeling that the system isn't working, and they don't trust governments to deliver either on the economics or on the climate side. And then I think we've got two very different electoral responses. And again, this is a broad brush comment, and there are nuances, but I think how that's playing out. On the right wing, the sort of populist side of things, and we think they're going to do well, right-wing parties and populist parties, both in the European parliamentary elections as well as in the United States. Who knows exactly where that will land, but there certainly is a groundswell. And in terms of a sort of populist mandate, it's very much on a fear of outsiders. It blames elites and outsiders for the sort of problems of the day. And it looks for, and I think we've heard this talked to this morning already, these short-term wins. They might not make a lot of economic sense, but they can often be very popular. So there's a real short-termism. A lot of that's channeled into anti-immigration policies. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts, Seema, on this. But it's also reflected in antipathy towards international institutions and a real dialing up of rhetoric towards the other, particularly China. So we see these kind of real hawkishness. That, again, not particularly economically sensible, we might say, but there's a real populist narrative that makes him electorally popular. The other big contenders in this year's elections, and here I'm thinking about the Biden administration as well as the UK Labour Party. I think they're both sort of political forces that might well find themselves in power as well. And that's the sort of centre-left, and they've got a very different policy response. And that is a policy response that is avowedly activist industrial policy and very much green activist industrial policy. So we're going to see that, I think, if Biden administration wins, and we're going to see it if Labour wins in the UK. And I think this we need to take very seriously. It is a serious attempt to recalibrate the economic model and to address very deeply those dysfunctionalities I've outlined. It's an attempt to re-embed the economic model in society and restore faith of citizens that their governments can actually really deliver. It's a long-term, serious project. Yes, we might criticize it in different ways, but I think it's a serious project. It's harder, though, and I think we've seen this play out in the United States, to garner the political support around that. But none of this sits particularly easily alongside the calls from the trade policy community, which continue to be the sort of restore the old system, let's do open markets, let's do free trade, let's strictly adhere to the WTO and the rules. Even if that were desirable, and I'm happy to discuss that, I don't think in this political moment it's the vision that we need. So whether for pragmatic or sort of whether for normative, we believe in this direction of travel, or even just from sheer pragmatism point of view, we need to build a new consensus for trade policy and at the WTO. And I think we avowedly need to make more room for, and to be seen to make more room for, serious attempts to recalibrate these economic models, to re-embed them in society and these industrial policies, and take seriously the concerns about environment. So that means more space for and more flexibility, more accommodating of each other. And the second point then is where tensions do arise, really looking to foster dialogue among the big powers and find pragmatic ways forward. So again, rather than judicializing the sort of problems, I think diplomacy and pragmatism are probably how we're going to have to muddle through. It's not easy, but I think we've got a really important project of re-embedding and supporting that re-embedding of and recalibration of the economic model in society and sort of restoring actually the health of our democracies as we do so.
Thank you very much, Emily, for that's a very helpful overview, I think, of some of the themes and questions that are relevant to this discussion. Keith, one of the kind of consistent themes throughout Emily's remarks is the influence of the US and its policy choices and its elections on the kind of global trade environment. I know you've got some overview remarks for us and you're going to be touching on that too. But first, we are going to have our own electoral experiment. So, Sam, I believe people are going to see a poll question shortly. We'd like to gauge the views of the audience on, do you expect the outcomes of this election super year from the US to the European Parliament to India to Indonesia to improve global trade and business conditions? So all of these elections, is this going to help? Yes or no. People can vote by using the QR code, which is on the back of your packs. So please do go ahead and participate in democracy for us. Thank you. I can give everybody a few minutes to figure that out, and then we'll come to you, Keith. Is it on the screen? Okay, while everyone is having a go at voting, it's just good to exercise the muscle. There's a lot of elections this year. I'm going to turn to Keith for his remarks. So over to you, Keith.
Thank you very much, Olivia. It's great to be back here. On the surface, it may appear that the year to come will be a rather bland one for trade. Why do I say that? Well, it's clear that trade growth this year is going to taper off significantly from last year. WTO is recalibrating its projections, but it certainly won't be 3.3%. We have seen the US and the EU step away from a variety of conflicts, be they on steel, be they on critical raw materials, be they on environment, CBAM and IRA. Even US and China seems to have calmed down a little bit, although at the People's Congress in Beijing, you might get another impression. The WTO ministerial that ended last week was disappointingly short of results. So if you look at it in aggregate from that perspective, it may seem like not much is happening, but that's just on the surface, and that's just right now. And the reason a lot of these things have been put in aspic, as it were, is because of the events of the 5th of November, the US election. I think it's almost for sure that Brussels and Washington have decided to calm things down because the Europeans are not terribly keen to see a return to the White House of Mr. Trump. And certainly Joe Biden doesn't want that either. So while that may be the case for the moment, I would not expect that to be the case by the time the calendar turns next year. There are things happening now that are tremendously dynamic. Supply chains are being reoriented. It's quite amazing to look at China's trade patterns. Trade with the US was down about 20% last year, but look at what their trade is with Mexico, Vietnam, India, and look at how those countries are exporting to the United States. So you're seeing circumvention of the duties on Chinese goods. And I think this is really going to come to a head with one specific product, which we talked about a little bit in the first panel, and that's electric vehicles. Now, electric vehicles is about a lot of things. It's about environmental policy, to be sure. My own view is that it's much more about industrial policy. Trade policy is an afterthought, which is, for the United States, a little bit unfortunate because all the critical raw materials that are needed to build batteries, which constitute 30 to 40% of the value of the car, are not to be found in the United States of America. They have to be imported, which is why they have come up with this rather strange form for awarding the tax breaks that are handed out, the subsidies, which is only for those countries with which the United States has a trade agreement. Well, Japan is a world beater when it comes to battery technology, but the US doesn't have a trade agreement with them, so they have a pretend trade agreement with them, which is a critical raw materials trade agreement with them. The Europeans would very much like to have this deal as well. And there's quite a lot of interaction between the auto industries of the US and the EU, but there are many other factors at play with respect to the EU-US trade relationship. Including steel, and that's an old-fashioned industry, one that Mr. Trump and his U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer, who I expect, if Trump wins, to return in some important capacity. Steel is very important for them, and there's disagreement about capacity, disagreement about how green these products are, disagreement about how to deal with China. Because the Americans are pretty blasé about WTO rules. The Europeans are not. The Europeans will not single out the Chinese in the way that the Americans would like. And then the last issue on which they have difficulty is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which the Americans, for all their green rhetoric, do not like. And they do not like it because it will impact steel producers in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio. So these disagreements have been put to the side regardless of who wins. That's coming back. I don't think, and Ignacio, we can talk to this more than me, I would be very surprised if European patience is maintained into 2025 if the variety of tensions that are at play now and have subsided to a degree. China is going to be a problem in terms of trade relations for the United States, regardless of who wins. There's a very interesting dynamic at play with the Europeans and their subsidies, their countervailing duty investigation into electric vehicles. If that were to come to pass, I think the duty on the cars coming in would be an additional 10%. And if you look at the cost competitiveness of these manufacturers, that's not going to deter too many consumers from buying their cars. The US, it's 27.5% tariff on Chinese cars, but what I would keep a very close eye on is what companies like BYD are doing in Mexico now. If they decide to set up production in Mexico, how will the United States respond? Because if they're made under the rules of the USMCA, those products are supposed to come into the country duty-free. One thing to keep an eye on is how the national security issue is played, because there could be a decision that says that cars made by Chinese electric producers may have software in them which is in some way a threat to the national security of the country, in the same way that Huawei products for telecoms were. Keep an eye on that, because otherwise they're going to have a very hard time keeping those cars out. There are so many other things to talk about, but the key thing to look at, I think, is how, if Donald Trump wins, trade policy may be pretty much the same. He's going to put a 10% tariff on everything, he says. Whether he can legally do that, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but we have plenty of them here who could probably tell us. But I think on industrial policy, and that goes for the IRA, he's going to be hard-pressed to uproot what's in place now, because it's benefiting a lot of the red states that will vote for him. You see Republican congressmen who voted against the IRA going to ribbon-cutting ceremonies for bridges and chips manufacturing facilities that are courtesy of these three important bills: infrastructure, chips and technology, and the IRA. So that is going to be very interesting to watch, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Keith. I think very helpful overview of kind of what we can expect from what will be an absolutely pivotal election on this issue. I can reveal the results of our poll as well. They're kind of numbers reminiscent of sort of authoritarian countries' elections, I have to say. So just to remind everyone, the question was, do you expect the outcomes of the election super year, so from the US to Europe to India to Indonesia, to improve global trade and business conditions? 13% of you thought yes, 87% thought no. So I think we can conclude from that like some real concerns about the interaction of democracy, and especially the sort of populist trends in democracy, some of the big elections like the one in the US, with trade and with the trade order. Mm-hmm. I think it is appropriate to now turn to Karim, because Karim, you're going to offer us some comments. It's great to have someone on the panel who actively advises businesses kind of day to day and thinks about how they navigate this difficult, choppy environment. So over to you for your comments, Karim.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Olivia. I'm representing London Chamber of Commerce, which is a membership organization, and the work that LCCI, London Chamber of Commerce, and international chambers network undertake to facilitate the increased trade flow around the world, how these are affected by the macroeconomic and geopolitical forces, such as an election, as you suggested earlier on. An election year will undoubtedly present opportunity to enhance our global prosperity through the trade. However, we must be wary of the risk posed by the free and fair trade if the international actors continue to turn increasingly towards the path of deglobalization and protectionism. UK trade policies must be prepared to rise and meet these changes through these elections and work with like-minded people that we are all around here today to defend the free market, free society, human rights, and the environment, while boosting the enterprise by lowering the barriers to trade. Our country, UK, has an important regulatory role to play in the new form outside of the European Union, particularly around emerging and frontier technology. A good example of this is the UK hosted the AI Safety Summit last November. We have an opportunity to be both nimble, but also bring together diverse sectors like USA, European Union, and China to collaborate on a big regulatory governance issue in a way that few countries can. Businesses, especially in UK, facing complex challenges on numerous fronts, and they rely on a stable economic landscape and political certainty in order to make this critical business decision and invest for growth. They will be opportunity looking at their international supply chain and considering how to mitigate this potential impact from these elections, which we have serious implication for their ability to operate. But in terms of the chamber itself, we're the voice of London. And as Emily mentioned, we are restoring faith in business conditions. And we are continuously helping business to navigate through these recent changes, what we had, especially for the forthcoming election, both in the UK and USA. But London is always been a great city to trade, and we are always advising our members and our stakeholders how to navigate, where we need to do, how we can speak to the decision makers within the government, and we have a voice for London. And we have been successful in navigating through these challenges ahead. And we all need your help as well to make London the greatest city in the world to trade globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kareem. And thanks for bringing in the kind of UK perspective there. I think that leads on quite nicely to SEMA, because SEMA is going to reflect on the role that immigration will play in both the election year and in trade, and that issue is absolutely salient in the UK election that is coming up, and also in lots of questions we have about how our economy functions. So over to you, Suma, for some reflections on that.
And in all of the other elections as well.
Of course,
so you just need to look at some of the exit polls that came out of Super Tuesday, where people were saying that the economy and immigration were two of the biggest issues that were impacting how they voted. Similarly, we know that in the UK, the release of the migration statistics in November triggered a series of interventionist policies, some of which are coming into force in April. Mexico as well, we know that there is continued pressure around Mexico and Canada at the moment, so Canada is reintroducing visa restrictions for some Mexican nationals. And immigration policy and mobility agreements also playing a really interesting, slightly different role in the elections in India. So to understand kind of immigration and the trade pieces, it's important to kind of step back a bit and just understand what is going on globally with immigration at the moment. And the challenge for policymakers right now is, and it's a long-standing challenge, is that it's not possible to just shut the door on immigration. The economic conditions that we're in, geostrategic pressures mean that it's just not viable, either from an opportunity perspective or from a needs-based perspective. If you look at it from an opportunity perspective, again, there is still so much unrealized opportunity in migration. So at the moment, it's said that migration is delivering an economic output of 9 trillion, with the opportunity for that economic output to double by 2050. Similarly, you've got migrants all over the world contributing, making up 3.4% of the workforce, but 10% of GDP. So there's huge opportunity there that policymakers are looking to continue to tap into. But if you leave aside the opportunity, there is a critical need for sustainable migration policies at the moment. Now, firstly, aging population across the EU. 40 million workers in the EU are going to leave the workforce in the next 20 years. There are talent shortages globally right now, skills shortages and emerging technologies that we've spoken about today, AI, digitization, sustainability, climate solutions, or climate management. And the EU coined the green and digital issues the twin transition. And these are causing huge challenges for migration systems at the moment, with 44% of workers' core skills being challenged by the new types of jobs and the new skills that are going to be needed in the future. The ILO estimates that 24 million green jobs are going to be created by 2030. That's 6 years' time. So there is a deep need for innovative thinking around access to talent and productivity. There was an interesting article by Bloomberg last week where they talked about migration in the context of protecting the US from falling into a recession post-pandemic through the contribution of migration there. And in the US, they say that the gap between migration policies as they exist and as they might be is about a 1.75 trillion economic deficit. When you put that into a global context, again, the research is showing that there's going to be a global talent shortage of 85 million people by 2030, which is an $8.5 trillion dollars worth of unrealized revenue. Similarly, across Europe, you're seeing productivity issues. So European Commission reporting that 42% of services companies in Germany, for example, are unable to achieve the productivity levels that they need because of access to talent. And we heard from Jennifer this morning about climate migration. Climate migration challenges are real, and they will come quickly, and they are going to hit migration systems and disrupt them in the same way that we've seen recent conflicts disrupt migration systems. So we have a situation now where we've come out of a pandemic, we're in the middle of two global conflicts, and there is a lot of challenge there, but also a lot of learning opportunity from what we've seen there. Immigration systems themselves are at a bit of a critical juncture right now. And like I said, there's been disruption upon disruption. But how we would view it is that systems are we talk about post-pandemic. Immigration systems are really post-pandemic. I mean, global immigration systems moved at accelerated speed during the pandemic to manage the mass displacement of people who were stuck with borders crossing, opening, shutting at ferocious speed. And there is huge change coming from AI. Now, the interesting thing about AI and immigration is that on the one hand, you see how AI is actually going to simplify immigration processes. And AI has actually been used in global immigration systems for some time, whether it's through border security, whether it's through application systems, et cetera. And that's going to continue at quite an accelerated pace. But of course, when we look at future jobs, future talent, et cetera, and we were talking about this earlier, digitization and increased use of AI, what is that actually going to mean for the future of migration? What is the type of migration that governments are going to need and want to tap into in the future? And again, that change is going to happen at speed. What are governments doing right now? And you talked about the AI Tech Safety Summit. Now, the US and the UK are two countries where immigration plays very heavily into political debate. Often in a negative way. But if you look at what happened just before the Tech Safety Summit, both of these governments that are facing challenges on migration policy introduced specific migration measures to access tech talent, to access AI talent, to put them at the forefront of competition on these new and emerging technologies. So there was a executive order from Biden a couple of days before the summit, followed by announcements by the UK government that they would introduce initiatives that were specific and bespoke to AI talent. And interestingly, there's something that's happening in parallel, which is related around the conflict displacement that we're seeing at the moment. And actually, we're seeing very innovative approaches to displaced populations and what governments can actually be doing to better integrate displaced populations into the workforce, to plug labour gaps, to support economic independency of migrants and refugees who find themselves forcibly displaced into host locations. So this is quite a challenge, right? There's an awful lot going on there. And that's a very, very difficult balancing act for policymakers. And this is where trade agreements and regional bilateral mobility agreements can play a significant role because it depoliticizes some of those challenges. It allows governments to be more strategic around what is it that's going to work for them in that short, mid and long-term position. And we're seeing that these agreements can give governments flexibility and more agility, which is more politically viable than potentially some of the broad brush immigration measures that they might introduce. And I'll just close by saying that more than 70% of the trade agreements that we're seeing now, the preferential trade agreements that we're seeing, have a form of immigration measure in them. And there's a very interesting report by the World Bank which reports that these measures can improve migration stock by 5.9%. Just one closing comment, and it's very wrong of me to do this as a closing comment. It should probably be an opening comment, which is we are on the eve of International Women's Day, right? We're talking about trade. We're talking about climate displacement and climate disruption. We're talking about migration. All of these are intersecting risks for women in particular. And it's really important that we put that at the forefront of our conversation now and try and solve for some of these long challenges before they become too difficult for us to handle.
Brilliant, thank you, Seema, and thanks for introducing that issue into the debate as well. I'm keen that we go to questions. I mean, just one brief follow-up for the panel before we do. I'll give everybody a chance to think of their questions. All of your reflections were about how, to some degree, about how politicians in this big year of elections can meet voters' demands. Voters have become increasingly disillusioned with existing economic models. Emily, you were talking about that. All the comments in some way threaded through with that. voters' demands on immigration too. But the sort of one of the biggest moves on this has been Bidenomics. And maybe I'm being too short-term about this, but it doesn't seem like Biden is reaping the electoral rewards. So all of these kind of quite interventionist moves on trade, subsidies and that kind of thing, which has supposedly been done to counter populism or serve voters' demands, are maybe not sort of having the electoral effect that certainly Biden and maybe others are seeking. Do voters care about this? Do they really notice, or do they attribute the effects to the right cause? I don't know if anybody wants to sort of take that, speaking of just how trade policies interact with elections.
Well, I think it's a little bit early still. I think that there are other factors at play. The inflation problem that had beset the country previously, those effects are still being swallowed. Because even though I think inflation now is under 3%, people are looking at what they pay for goods now compared to what they paid for goods 2 or 3 years ago, and they're up 20%. And so that is a holdover, and I don't know that people are giving Biden the credit for particularly things like the infrastructure bill. All of these things are infrastructure bills in a way. And they're just not, they don't see the ramifications of this immediately. And they're focusing on other things, his age, the problems in the Middle East, immigration, all of these things. And that seems to be something that's, at the moment anyway, overshadowing the accomplishments that he has on the economy.
Emily, did you want to add something on that, and then I'll take questions?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's a challenge you see the Labour Party contemplating here in the UK as well. Like, it's a long-term project. Infrastructure payoffs, we know, are substantial, but they're long-term, as you say. You're only now getting shovels in the ground. You're going to see off the payoff in terms of productivity 10 years hence. You know, and the populace is coming in with a short-term, I've got the answer, I've got the solution right now. And I think the genuine challenge, again, if you think of delivering on this, what can you do in the short term to start to restore faith? And actually, I think trying to find some quick wins that also align with this economic project. So trying to get the politics to align with the industrial strategy and kind of the electoral gains from it. But I think that's exactly where the pinch point will be for Labour Party if they're get in power as well.
And presumably to get the immigration policy to align with the electoral politics as well.
For sure. And
let's take some questions because I'm conscious of time, but thank you for coming back on that. Who would like to ask our panel? Surprisingly quiet audience. So just, I'll take the gentleman here with a bit. If you can say your name and where you're from and then ask your question.
Hi, I'm Matthew Preston-Bloom from AIG. I am a lawyer, so. We've heard here that the core concerns are things like immigration, things like political payoff not being received for decisions being made now, but potentially will be looked back on favourably in a decade, which is unfortunately too late. It also seems that a lot of this and a lot of the misunderstanding from voters stems from misinformation being shared on the internet, specifically social media. My question, I suppose, to the entire panel is, do you not think that the regulation of social media now may allow the payoff to be received more quickly for the decisions being made by the current government and those in opposition?
Thanks, Matthew. I'll take a few questions at a time. The gentleman there in the glasses.
Thanks very much. Rowley Sword from SC Strategy. We're a geopolitical risk consultancy. I wanted to ask about the EV point. I was at a separate event, apologies, this morning on China and, peak China, whether or not that's happened. And there were two sort of diametrically opposed views that came out about how the EU will react to EVs. On the one hand, the argument was that they will follow the US model and basically put up the fences and close that off because of the importance of the industry to particularly Germany. On the other hand, and I think to the point of elections, it was that the governments are more likely to follow popular interest and desires, which is high quality products at a cheaper price. And so therefore within the EU, it's more likely that more governments would be against imposing sanctions. Trade barriers. So I'd just be interested to know what your views are on which way you think it might go.
Great, thank you. I'll take one more. The gentleman here at the front had a question.
No, thank you. My question goes to Emily and Keith, because you have been talking about US electoral politics. And paradoxically, if Trump gets elected, we know more or less the trade policy which is going to apply. We have seen it before. We know who are going to be the key actors. If Biden gets reelected, what is your expectation about what could be the trade policy of a second Biden administration? And clearly, it's not going to be going back to the days of Mike Froman. I think, Emily, you have said that very clearly. But what kind of trade policy you would expect in a second Biden administration? Is it going to be more of the same, or do you expect some kind of inflections in terms of how trade policy would be developed?
Thanks very much. Okay, so we've got the role of the regulation of social media on these elections and how that might affect how people view trade and the economy. We've got where might Europe go on EV policy, and we've got what might a second Biden term bode for trade policy. Would anyone like to take any of those first? Emily, the Biden trade policy was directed at you, so do you want to come in on that?
I was going to actually kick that one to Keith, because I feel with Keith on the panel, I think he's probably better positioned on that one. I'm happy to come on the digital one, if that
Great.
helps.
Accents can be deceiving, I'm afraid. Just to say, we talked about this before, Ignacio. In the second Obama administration, there was quite a change in terms of their outlook towards trade. I don't know whether that will happen this time around. He doesn't face the prospect of re-election, but the subject of trade is so toxic in the U.S. right now, and this, in a way, picks up on the social media question because there's so much misinformation out there. I think there are people in this administration who are so, to their very core, anti-trade, because for them it represents big corporations, and that is, by extension, very bad. And that's the feeling that they have, and it permeates almost everything. It's a very unfortunate situation because, of course, it's not true. And so I don't know that it will change to any meaningful degree, which I think is unfortunate.
Thank you, Keith. Emily, on the social media regulation question.
So to say, well, as a trade policy person, you're getting me well out of my comfort zone, but I do think it's really important. And I think a lot of governments are very attuned to that, and I think there are genuine challenges of how do you do content moderation and how do you regulate that effectively. So I think we're seeing bills go through many parliaments and legislative branches. I was in Brazil recently, and again, huge issue. So I think it's absolutely key. I think the interesting bit is the digital and trade space actually as well. We're seeing a lot of, that's where rulemaking is happening relatively quickly outside of the WTO, but at the free trade sort of bilateral level. And there I think, again, we need to think quite carefully about what we're putting into those trade agreements and whether we're doing enough to sort of think through the public policy ramifications of digital. So on AI regulation, I think, for instance, to give you one, we're now looking to try and regulate much more at a domestic space AI products. And it's in some points, we've got a clash actually with what we're putting in trade agreements. So I think we've got to think through, as we move quite fast on the trade space, on digital, whether and how, to what extent that actually aligns with some of the public policy debates domestically.
Can I just add very quickly that the EU is so far ahead on this, whether it's GDPR, whether it's the Digital Markets Act, whether it's the Digital Platforms Act, what's that called again? The Digital Services Act with the gatekeepers. The US has nothing like this. And yet they have the biggest tech companies in the world. And they are all adhering to the EU because you can't beat something with nothing. And the EU has in place something which they may not like, but at least they know what it is. And in the US, they don't know what it is. There's executive orders and whatnot that may not survive another election.
Thank you. The final question from the gentleman was on just where we think EU policy might go on EVs. Do any members of the panel want to come back on that one?
Well, we have a man here who could answer it with a much greater degree of clarity and expertise than me. I would simply say that they are taking a far more open-minded approach to this. In the U.S., if it's China, it's going to be bad. And in the EU, they're looking at it very carefully. But the solar panel industry in this part of the world was wiped out. And if you have automobile companies wiped out, you're going to have a serious problem, particularly in the largest member country of the European Union. And they're far behind in terms of developing this technology. So what tack they take, I don't know. The US, they're just not going to let these cars in. And I don't know how long the EU will stick to the line they have now, but I suspect they won't be quite as hardline as the US.
Thank you. And perhaps we can get the two of you to talk over coffee and he can give you an answer. Let's take another round of questions, shall we? If any women have a question, please. Delighted with all, please do all ask questions, but lady down there.
Since you've highlighted the risks of
Do you want to just say your name and where you're from?
Oh, sorry. Caroline Messica, Strategic Markets Editor for Technology Metals at Fast Markets.
Great.
It's a great conference, thank you. Just you've highlighted the role of misinformation and populism and the sort of the potential impact from that. Very out of the box question, sorry, but what could governments be doing to improve the information space generally? I know that in the UK, people, to get a news story really big, it has to be a Netflix serial. So we definitely have an information vacuum here. Are there any brilliant ideas on how we could improve the information space, not just regulate the tech?
Brilliant, thank you. The young man here had a question.
Hi all, Joe Green from the UK Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. It's a very short name. But I just wanted to ask the whole panel that based on like how politically popular it almost is to be hard on trade, much like other foreign policy areas, how that might scope out with this increased political culture of like scarcity that we might have, the concept that people have less money, the idea that we're running out of resources, etc. Will this just evolve into less trade deals being made, generally speaking, or the longer maintenance of, you know, really long-standing agreements that might already be in place?
Great stuff, thank you. I'll take one more gentleman here.
Thanks. Lauren Bartels from Cambridge and Freshfields. Back to the US. I'm wondering what you think of a Trump digital trade policy. That could be an area where there is some difference between the two sides. Also bearing in mind the exciting news that Congress has asked USTR to explain what the hell it was thinking in rapidly reversing its previous pro-digital trade policies over the last few months.
Great stuff, thank you. So we've got what could governments be doing more to improve the information space? Broader question on kind of the political popularity of being hard on trade and how that might play out in an environment where people are feeling scarcity more. And then the question on kind of Trump, what a Trump digital trade policy might look like. Seema, did you want to come in on the information space?
And it occurred to me when we were listening to the question around social media regulation as well, which is that there are understanding, if we're looking in the context of immigration, right? So understanding the economic productivity of immigration is something that is under researched or at least under published. There's a report that we put out a few weeks ago with the City of London Corporation on, you know, what are the direct and indirect impacts that are directly flowing to economies, and how are these talent strategies actually leading to job creation in the economy. But if you look at the UK in particular, immigration in the UK, you have most migrants that come into the UK will be paying a very significant contribution into the National Health Service. They'll be paying a very significant contribution, and employers who sponsor them into the domestic skills pipeline through the immigration skills charge. Now, these are huge amounts of money. I don't have the current data at the top of my head, but it's in billions. And how well known is this among, you know, the populations that are looking at the impact of immigration? I question that. But the other piece is that there is a real need also in order to get a sustainable migration policy, you have to look at your domestic skills investment. How much are we investing in domestic skills? And until you can get people comfortable with the investment that's going into the domestic labour market, you're always going to have this challenge around immigration. So it's very important to focus there. It's very important to focus on the economic strategy, but also to look at actual payments that are sitting in the Treasury that are attributable to migration policies. There's just one other point that I wanted to make, which is businesses are getting on and doing what they have to do around all of this disruption. And we heard earlier about diversified supply chains. The same applies to talent. They are diversifying their supply chains around talent, looking at strategic talent locations. Where does it make sense for us to position our global talent sectors in the future? Offshoring, onshoring, nearshoring, all kinds of models. And the real risk is that if governments are not fast enough and innovative enough around these kind of trade agreements that we're talking about, businesses will have already taken their decisions about where they're going to locate their talent, and it may be too late then to shut the stable door.
Thank you for that. Did you want to come in, Graham?
Just going back on the trade. Trade is basically the bloodline of our country and globally. And being in business for 3 decades, I understand how it works, because I run 2 different separate companies before I joined the LCCI. And it takes a lot to prove to the government what is the regulation, deregulation. And I do believe very strongly, speaking to both party leaders, that trade is the top priority for our coexistence, whether it's in the UK, globally. But it is important. And I'm glad last week Labour Party as well confirmed about the industrial strategy. That's very important, because almost over 90% of our businesses are SMEs in the UK. And that's a big volume. And that's why we represent over 8,000 active members within the chamber. And these are the ones the future relies on. And that's how important it is trade, because we are a global nation. And UK has been predominantly in terms of exporter strategy, industrial strategy, and we are the leaders when it comes to it. Having seen the last 5 years, what has been happening in terms of COVID, Brexit, and etc. But we bounced back. We did, and we are going to move forward. But it is vital. When it comes to trade, we have to be cautious, very careful. The way we need to address the government of the day, it is very important to success of any business, either side of the world. And it's important. Just going to what earlier on Simo alluded about women entrepreneur in business. London Chamber was a pioneer of the discussion on free trade agreement when it comes to why shortages of women in terms of negotiation globally. And that has been proved that women can do much more entrepreneurial skill and deliver globally. And we managed to speak to the Department of Business and Trade, and of course, that has been part of the agenda of free trade agreement, which you mentioned. And thank you for bringing this one up. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem. We've just coming up on time. I wonder if other panelists want to expand on. So Kareem was kind of talking about the importance of trade, but to the question about like how might a political atmosphere of increased sort of worry, a sense of scarcity, affect that, and also the question on a potential Trump digital trade policy. Emily?
I'll come in on the digital trade policy in the US, because I think it's gone through a really interesting evolution. So I think we saw under the Obama administration, I think the sort of, not entirely true, but I think the catchphrase was at the time, Silicon Valley kind of wrote the digital trade chapter there. So there was a real sense that it very much, US policy aligned very closely with the large technology companies. As you've said, what's really interesting, we saw continuity actually on that side through the Trump administration, and Biden, IPEF, WTO, there was still a lot of those core principles in place. They've done an about turn in November and pulled back from a lot of the policies there. And I think it's part of a bigger rethink about how to regulate the technology companies in the technology space in the United States. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, we've seen in the digital trade space, I think the weaponization of particularly advanced semiconductors and China's access to critical technologies on digital. So those are the two trends, I think. and I'd be interested to see what you think, Keith, on this. But I think in terms of Trump, on the information regulation discussion we've just been having, I don't think we're going to see any content moderation. Like, we're not going to be regulating that space, and we all can see the reasons why. I think there'll be a doubling down on the China technologies and stopping China getting access. I think we're already seeing fallout and blowback, and I don't think that's actually working. I think we're seeing China invest heavily, a greater alliance actually between the Chinese technology companies and the Chinese government, and huge advances very quickly. So I think it's a pretty flawed strategy. Actually, and for many reasons. I think it doesn't work for the United States either, because a lot of the semiconductor firms are losing the market share in China, have less revenue to pour into R&D, so they're concerned they're going to be not able to keep at the technological frontier. So, but I think we'll see a policy. I don't think it's going to work. And finally, on the digital trade side, I just don't think there's the appetite in Congress to do trade agreements. So I think that space is pretty stuck. I think the big question is what they'll do domestically with the regulation of technology companies. My sense is feet off the accelerator on that one would be my expectation.
Well, interestingly, when Donald Trump was the president, Bob Lighthizer decided that the United States would participate in the e-commerce plurilateral negotiations. Trump is a transactional person. He looks at trade surpluses as being an indication of vitality, and very few parts of the American economy have bigger trade surpluses or more market dominance than the tech sector. I think that with respect to any kind of sweeping regulation along the lines of what they have in Brussels, it's not going to happen. The political polarization in the country now, you saw it on the immigration bill. This is something that apparently most of the people wanted, but they decided not to go for it because it was taking away an election issue from Donald Trump. So I would not expect anything major to come about on this. I'd like to just ask you to just comment briefly on the whole question of shortages and of people lacking resources. One of the problems, I think, is that too many people see trade as a zero-sum game, when it really does increase the size of the pie for everyone. All of the evidence suggests this. Trump is someone who thinks that I win, you lose, because I have a trade surplus. That's just not economically sound, but that's what he thinks. And I think that kind of thinking has permeated too much of our discussion globally now.
Thank you, Keith. And we are just coming up on time. So unfortunately, we are going to have to end on that rather dour note. But I actually think it has tried to... I think it has tied together a lot of the themes of this discussion, which is the kind of interaction of politics, but particularly populist politics and the global trade order and the kinds of questions that it throws up. Thank you to everyone for your questions and for your comments. It sounded like there were a lot of things people would be keen to continue to discuss in the breaks, and a lot of knowledge in our audience too. So I won't keep you any longer. All I will do is say a really warm thank you to our panel for a very rich and varied discussion, and thank you to you all for joining us. Thanks very much.